This one's for the disruptors, the uncommon, the unconventional, the rebels. You're not here to take things lying down. Well, season 2 is about shaking things up. I'm Beatrice, and this is the Art of Branding podcast. Be ready, be badass. Let's shake some shit up. And we're back with your co-host in all things sound, badass podcasting, and the magician behind the production of the Art of Branding and many others. Elijah, welcome back. It's been, well, for us, it's been like maybe a little while.
47 minutes? Yeah. Yeah. Uh-huh. For everybody else, it's been ages.
It's been ages. It's just been ages. We're just like at the back just chatting. But before this, we were talking about Sam Carr. There was some research out on his new expansion, right? And, you know, he's had a very focused audience where businesses must be generating at least $1 million in revenue, or you must have raised $3 million in venture capital, or you must have had a previously successful exit, which is anyhow ends up being like over 5 million, right? So that meant for him, right, knowing that TikTok, LinkedIn, and other socials like that did not end up being, you know, it doesn't really make much sense in terms of putting out like content and having that target market actually consume. And finding out finally that was like podcasting. Going through that process where like, okay, they're defining that deep interest with him, right? Like, okay, so what are they interested in? Money, right? How to get more money. And that's how like he named his and directed his podcast, right? Money Wise. It's not his first podcast, but it offers a different approach and intention. What are your thoughts in terms of that approach?
Some people try to mash everything together in their personal, their business, and all this stuff with podcasting. But it really makes sense when somebody goes out and says, I have a personal brand, but I have a podcast for that. But I'm also going to figure out, well, my audience and the people I'm selling to really doesn't fit into this personal brand. So I'm going to go ahead and make a whole new podcast, the business podcast for my business people. And because he has a team and everything else going on, it really makes sense. And for other people who are doing it themselves, they're probably overwhelmed. They're going cross-eyed and their head's spinning because it's so much work. But I guess that's the same as figuring out your audience. And then you dive into your ICP with brand strategy. You got to really figure out your audience and how it fits. And podcasting is really just another avenue like social media. It's just to get that top of funnel or that deep connection with your audience. So how you're going to do that is totally up to you. But in his sense, it really makes sense. And on top of that, I've seen more and more creators actually take time to record the clips separately. That's a whole, like a farming engine for marketing. They don't necessarily take the podcast long form and then create short form. They create hooks specifically to drive the audience to their social media clips, which I thought was really cool too. So I'm sure Sam Carr is doing all of this to really get engagement and interest, especially if you see that really cool clippy stuff on TikTok. So he's doing all this magic and just creating content like it's breathing, like it's going out of style, like there's nothing else going on, just shoving content in people's faces until they react. And he's just getting there and really that whole sales engine where you're just kind of hitting the masses so much that eventually somebody's going to pick that up and resonate with it and then share that. And then it just kind of snowballs and gets excited. So I think it's great for the right audience, but you also have to know how to market that to the right audience and then figure out part of that brand strategy, if that works for you, and is it worth it to segregate or separate your personal brand podcast with your business brand podcast?
I mean, it makes sense, right? Like he's got a media agency. So like he has those resources to be able to do that. And so what you were saying is people are recording extra clips in addition to the podcast to promote the podcast.
Yes, it's for particular marketing agencies, and certainly can get some links for you in the comments. I forget the guy's name off the top of my head, but he actually separates the session. He'll have a podcast session, and then afterwards, the guest will just sit down with him, and he'll just basically feed him the hooks and the information. I'll feed you the questions you answer and get something punchy, and then they plan it out and strategize that whole system. And now it's not a complete different engine than the podcast, but it would relate to the meaty parts of your podcast, or hooking people and getting them excited or driving interest. Not necessarily just clickbait, but it's a whole separate production behind the scenes to get that advertising marketing for the specific podcast. It's like doing an ad for a movie. You don't always have the movie short clips, right? You create some sort of movie trailer or movie magic that gets people excited, or maybe kind of skewed a bit to make it look really exciting and reshot. But that's kind of the idea, where you get this marketing engine that's totally separate from your podcast. So you have something that's exciting, that's interesting, and that's very, very pointed and timely.
Yeah, and the thing is, like, they have that ability to be able to do that, and so much of that power and that capability is really understanding that audience. Like, the fact that he went into that level of detail, right? Like, okay, what positioning are they in? Like, what are they doing on their free time? Like, when they're actually in that mindset of wanting to learn and to grow, like they're like not just on the social media, like just for the entertainment, right? Like, finding that time and finding that moment, which I think it's a very fine balance. Having, choosing a platform, like, say, for example, Instagram. A lot of people go on Instagram and it's just purely so that they can switch off from whatever work, right? So, you could almost say that it would be quite challenging to be focused, like, hey, this is my business. Let's talk about, like, how to improve the business.
Especially when you're looking at going from a hobby to a professional entity. There's a huge business behind getting those big numbers. And people look at their downloads of 30 or 50 an episode, or maybe two, and they cry themselves to sleep because they're comparing themselves to folks like Sam Carr. But the magic behind the scenes, there's millions of dollars going into marketing, like your McDonald's or Netflix or Disney. And it's kind of insane, especially with YouTube clips. There's people, the big podcast names, that will go ahead and take 100 different A/B tests, and they'll go through different graphics and whatever they call the YouTube pictures for the podcast itself. They'll go through 100 different options, different facial reactions, different fonts, different colors, different ways to word things, and then they'll go through that testing and figure it out to what hits. So they're not just doing one or two, they're doing 100. And when that hits, they'll repeat that process to get that viral content going. So when people say, hey, I don't really have it, or I'm not doing enough, you probably aren't, but also you need to sleep and eat and probably be with your family or your dog or whatever you have at home.
I think a big part of it is, right, like, for business owners that aren't media giants, right? Like, and they're approaching, okay, we want to do a podcast. How should they frame it? Like, should they have a look at what other approaches there are, like, in their business area, like, in terms of framing it? Or, say, for example, looking into the numbers of, like, how many women in the age of, like, 20 to 35 are, what are they watching on, or what are they listening to on podcasts?
You're right. You've nailed it. And a lot of people don't treat podcast as a business. Even if you're making a hobby and you're just getting enough revenue to buy ice cream, like an ice cream cone a week, you're still going to have to go through the social media writing. You're still going to have to go through market strategy. You still have to identify your audience. You're still going to have to do all these pieces if you want to succeed. If you're just out there farting and burping and having a good time, then who cares, right? Whatever. You're just having fun with your friends and being just you, as if nobody's listening. That's fine. But if you want to grow your numbers and do all this stuff, then there is some overlap between business and market strategy. And branding strategy with your podcast, like the eye-catching graphics, the cover art, the competition, who's in the category that you're choosing, who's there, who's in the top 100, what are they doing that's cool, what could you emulate but not copy, what could you use as bits and pieces from all of these and then have something really cool for you. And with your podcast, trying to hone in on the feeling. You're badass. You like to kick things around. You like to kick people in the nuts with your heels. Whatever the badass image is, you want to get that rock and roll feel, and then have those little, sometimes the teasers at the beginning to really hook people in. Like, not a lot of people do this stuff, and then there's others who have segments. Like, I don't know, Conan O'Brien used to have a late night show. He'd have a monologue and something fun, and they'd riff off his little guy, not a little guy, but his sidekick that always has something funny to say. And then they talk to the guest for 10 minutes, and then the band would play. So there's all these different things that you could use in your mind to kind of emulate these different sections. And what I'm trying to say is, if you can stand out, if you can find a way to be unique, you can have a decent amount of audio that people aren't going to be distracted and be annoyed by. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be, you have to be able to hear the audio from the host and the guest. If you want to do a video, try and make it interesting as possible. And sometimes you just have to put it out and hope for the best. And sometimes you just kind of start with what you know and then continue to iterate as you go. So there are a bunch of different strategies, but I would just look at the people that exist that are doing it well and getting that attention, and then you can kind of figure out the pieces as you go. But if you're not willing to iterate or figure out the process bit by bit, and if you're not willing to put a little money into, say, some AI tools that'll help you kind of speed up the process where it makes sense, totally cool. And then you can have that AI assistant that can kind of help you get 80% of the way. And then you can kind of polish up your scripts or your descriptions or even the clips to kind of make sure there's a human element still there. So you can still do some of the work, but you don't have to go ahead and churn out all this insane content like Sam Carr does. You just have to have a good idea of how you're positioning yourself and how that translates into the podcast world, especially if you have a competition. 30,000 podcasts is nothing in a particular segment, especially with marketing and branding. Like, there's an insane amount of competition you have to worry about. Worry about the little things, try to be interesting, and just try to do something, throw spaghetti off the wall. See if it sticks. If it doesn't, it's just time, really, that you're out. And then you just kind of go back to the drawing board. What people get frustrated by is always evolving, always have to figure out, it's always changing, especially when podcasting in the common space is so early on, like YouTube's in the 2000s. People are still trying to figure out and pivot and see if it works. And everybody's confused. It's organized chaos. And one day could be stale. The next day could be interesting. So people have this going on. Like, it's just insane. Like somebody on ADHD or overdose of Ritalin, it just bonkers. And I think that's really what people don't appreciate in this creative space. It's not just go throw it out, record, and people come flock like your, I don't know, your favorite Disney character or Harley Quinn. People have to work at getting people's attention and bringing them in, just like they do social media, just like they do emails, just like they do blogs.
And that's something that we've talked about quite a lot, especially going into season 1, where it was like, okay, what sort of style works? And then going through that first season and recognizing beyond what works, but like what I resonate with, like, as a host, like you need to also be comfortable with that certain format, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then going into season 2, which is like all about disruption. And we've had discussions about like, okay, well, how can we make this season different? How can we approach things in a way that, say, for example, other podcasts aren't necessarily following the standard of? And, even I had a conversation, I think this was yesterday or the day before, and it was somebody talking about, like, I don't want to just have a interview with somebody for my business. And I was like, well, that's not the only option in terms of podcast. It doesn't even need to go for an hour or 2 hours. Like, there's a lot of like stereotypes at this point.
In this corporate space or this enterprise agile space, there's these scrum masters, and they're basically people who lead a project and figure out how things work and run, kind of like a conductor. And they do 5-minute episodes on YouTube every single day. They also have a podcast, but they're 5 minutes. They answer 1 or 2 questions from the community, and that's it. That's their podcast. They're done. And they do this daily, and they're hugely successful. You get this bite-sized nugget for busy entrepreneurs, busy executives, busy corporate types, and you just get what you need. You get exactly what you need. The question, the answer, they riff about it because they're two guys that are in the industry forever, and then they're gone. So you're right. It doesn't have to be an interview. It doesn't have to be you talking at a wall like you're an only child, staring at yourself in the mirror. It can be a bunch of these different things. But the danger part, when you add more people, if you're not great communicators, you're going to trip over each other. It's going to sound like a can of, I don't know, pick something that's nasty, like a camel's ass. I don't know. It's going to be terrible. That's really, truthfully, how it's going to be. But for you, communication wise, you stepped up your game. So I don't know what you did. I have an idea, but I didn't see you do the progression from season 1. You had like little exposure to an episode or a podcast, period. And then you went through 20 episodes. You did pretty well. And then all of a sudden in season 2, you just kind of came out of the gate and you like leveled up like 10 times. I hate 10x, but you get the idea. And then all of a sudden you're concise, and people like guests in the big time industry are coming to you and going, holy shit, that was really good. Like this is, and then there was another podcast gentleman that is huge. He's doing great. He used to be a car mechanic, and now he's killing it on the YouTube space and podcasting. He said, now that is how you do a podcast intro. To get from not knowing to zero to having industry professionals that are well renowned, at least on LinkedIn, which is pretty good B2B space, that compliment is huge. So you starting from scratch proves that you can iterate to the point where you're successful and figure things out. And if you threw away this podcast, nobody would care, not even you, but you have this evergreen content that is out there. And then if you started another podcast with what you knew, I'm pretty sure that you would even be able to charge your clients more because of that impression and that work that you put into the podcast authenticity to get there and relate to those clients.
Yeah.
If you can put in the work and you can prove that you're putting the work, I'm pretty sure that the clients will then want to do that too. It's really cool.
Exactly. There's so many different ways to approach, a podcast, and even talking about the voice, right? Like I'm the first one to admit the person and the voice that you see now, like, hasn't always been there. We were just talking about like, okay, just between season 1 and season 2, there's a change, right? But like, you compare who I was, 10 years ago to now is not even like you could not recognize that. And, that goes to say, hey, so what about the approach? Like faking it versus having that like intentional direction and growth around like the values and voice that you want to put out there.
And I think you're able to appropriately convey that without having that self-confidence gap. Now you're more authentic in yourself. You may not be the same as your stories on your personal Instagram, which is totally fine, but you are kind of approaching that personal, professional overlap with the confidence, and you can kind of steer those conversations with your clients. And even if you get, even now that you're in Spain, maybe you get public speaking opportunities, and I don't think you'll have a problem doing that. Maybe first season you would kind of stutter over things, perhaps because you did a lot of reading or you relied on a script. Now you rely on your intuition, your experience, your skills, and your knowledge, which then you can carry the podcast. And we were talking about how you used to have a full set of like a bazillion questions that you'd read. Okay, next question. I would like to ask you if, which was fine. It is funny to me because I've been doing this forever. But now you're like, okay, so I'm going to call you out on this. I call your bullshit. Tell me this. Why is this? And how come you did this? Like you're listening and then figuring out at the same time what you're going to say next. And most people with ADHD struggle to do this. For somebody that's divergent, um, to be able to go through that process is pretty cool. If you have a linear mind and you're be able to do two things at once, you're multitasking, thinking on the fly, and still be able to concentrate on something going on. That's a real task. And now you have these skills in place that I don't know where you'll take it next. But the confidence is huge, even from a practice standpoint. Even if you had a private podcast where you don't put it anywhere, you record a bunch of episodes and listen to it back, that's the basics of a podcast. And then you have that excitement and that skill and experience to be able to at least articulate well with your clients what you want and what you want for them. How do you feel? Is that true at all? Or are you going to, I don't know, be on the council, run the city? Are you going to be the mayor of some city in Spain? I don't know. What's next?
I mean, that could be fun for sure, but you're right. Like it is a crazy challenge, and a lot of the time you don't see that behind the scenes. A lot of people are like, oh, maybe I should get into podcasting. It's like there's a lot of work which you really need to consider that before you go into it. Like, is that going to be something that you're willing to commit? Because we've talked about this before, where people are like, okay, we're gonna do a podcast, and then get like 8 episodes or 10 episodes in that you mentioned from your experience, and then like they give up because they only recognize at that point like, oh shit, there's just all this other work, the multitasking of research in advance to make sure that it is actually like a good episode, and having that multitasking, listening. What would you say in terms of people approaching it for their voice? Do you think it's worth it to like fake it till you make it, or?
I really depends on what you want out of it. Like if you're okay with the fact that you're going to throw this project that you think is a pile of poo, then fine. To do 10 episodes, do it. Do a graphic that's decent, and you just do it for yourself to get out there and then share it with your friends and family or peers or your mentor. Sure. But there's a point where you're going to have to go, do I want to continue this? Is it worth continuing from, I don't know, what you might feel is in your self-image of utter garbage to amazing? There's also other avenues you can practice. Like there's different Toastmasters, speaking organizations. You could do live events. You can do all these things that kind of practice, whether you're going to an audio room in LinkedIn or a video live on Instagram or YouTube. You can do those things and then not keep the file, and then it's gone. The internet will never remember unless somebody is nasty and screenshots, but that's always what happens on the internet. You don't know. I'm saying 99% of the world won't remember. So if you're not willing to invest the time because of your confidence, or you don't have the time, try it out. The baby steps are available to you with the live events, or you can just record it at home. There's a lot of free tools. You can just start recording, even voice notes on your phone. Get on Voxer with your friend and just start recording for 5 minutes and getting some advice, or doing like Substack or whatever free blog platform, because you can do the podcast there and only send it out to email subscribers. So maybe you just get volunteers, 10 people, give me your email address. I'll send you a podcast episode, and maybe it'd be in a draw to win a free book that I wrote or whatever, right? So there's lots of ways that you can shield yourself from the embarrassment if you don't have the confidence. Otherwise, you get up there, it's like getting on stage in your underwear, in front of a comedy house for the first time and expect people to throw stuff at you. Like that's the vulnerability you have to get into, and people forget that you're on a stage in front in the same place as Jelly Roll doing stadiums. He's popular, he's famous, but he has a lack of self-confidence, right? But he kills it because he's good. So if you practice enough over the years, you're going to get to the point like yourself where you're good enough and you believe in yourself enough to go and do it long term. Because once you're doing it and enough people follow you, they're going to miss it and ask, why haven't you recorded this week? Because I need this content and I built this into my routine, and then I'm going to miss it. It's kind of odd, but it's satisfying. But you have to be ready to be vulnerable and
Mhm.
then do it long term and put up with whatever feedback the internet throws at you.
And see it like, look at it from different perspectives as well, right? Like it doesn't have to be, as you mentioned, like it doesn't have to be two friends chit chatting or like two business partners chit chatting. Like it could,
Mm.
the possibilities are limitless. Like it is to your creativity. Like same thing
Yeah.
for monetization, right? Like it's not something, some lofty goal, right? Like depending on how you think about it, that is all very possible.
I've seen some big comedians who, been in and out of uh, been out of jail or something, and the guy is going on this podcast, and he's a famous comedian, and he sells bongs and all this other paraphernalia because that's his brand. He's like this bad guy that kind of has this shady past, right? But he always talks about this recreational use all the time. So it's perfect for him. It seems silly for us. It won't be for some professionals, but for him, he makes a killing off of all the swag, off the merch, and off of these different things that he creates to have that recreational use because that's his stick and that's his kind of vibe. And for him, that's okay. You may not approve, or your audience may not approve, but for Joey Diaz, he's like, yeah, let's go. And he has this little sound effect of him pulling out of a bong in the first of his episodes all the time. So he is as unpolished as he seems. He's really figured out the marketing side and kind of pulled in his audience and figured out, okay, these people like recreational use of hobbies. I'm going to lean into this, and then the sponsors come in and they say, okay, we get it. Because if you're all over the place, that's another thing. If you're all over the place, then marketing agencies and advertisers aren't going to have a clue who is your audience, and they're not going to pay the big bucks per episode to figure that out and bring that audience in.
My gosh, yes, exactly. Like, you know, it's great to have that idea of doing something unexpected, but whatever it is that you choose, it should be something that's super consistent. So I know before this, we were talking about this ad that was promoting Oslo, right? And it goes in
Hmm.
about like this guy complaining about the city, and because of all his complaining, he's saying things that tourists would actually desire. But like as someone who's living there, who's like, oh, grumble, grumble, like this is so bad. Like the entire ad, like it is not come to Oslo kind of thing, but it's very deliberate. Like the tone is very deliberate.
You get into the reverse psychology of, don't do this. I'm like, oh, you want to bet? I'm going to because I'm a tourist. But everybody, any person that lives in a tourist city, like you go to Barcelona or for maybe Disney World in Florida, the locals hate it. It's crap because the tourist season, it drives in the most unappreciative types. There's some great tourists, but at the end of the day, you get the 1% of tourists who are just walking wherever they feel like it, getting in accidents, treating the local baristas like garbage, and that's why the tourists hate it. It's so relatable, but this guy's so cranky, and I don't know. Every stereotype about Oslo residents are him. Like this dude is pretty much what I would picture if I went to Oslo. There'd be somebody maybe mentally giving me the finger, maybe telling me off, telling me the wrong way to go somewhere because it amuses them. All of these things that locals like to do to tourists when they come in. But yeah, it really works. It's unconventional, it's different, it's something you wouldn't expect. And that's where people get lost. They have this conventional box for podcasting. When you throw it out the door and say, let's do this, and you're like, all right, and it works. And if it doesn't, off it goes.
And in terms of sound as well, right? Like in terms of sound and keeping it consistent. Like, so if, say, for example, if like we want to go take an unexpected route, right? Like even the sound, it's it's unexpected, but it should be consistent, right?
Sure. And you did that in season one, where pitched the idea of having callbacks. You were saying that your single, whatever you want to call them, host driven podcast episodes are too short. So we threw in some callbacks from previous episodes. There'd be episode 4, you'd have your solo, and you'd do a recap of the last quarter, the last 3 episodes, and we'd pull in clips from the guests and kind of have that build on your authority. Okay, well, if you don't believe Beatrice in this brand strategy method, then believe Michael or whoever it was, the gentleman with the flamingo, your buddy. That's an option. So if you can get stuff like that, it's more newsy and radio style, where you have people in the newsroom or like BBC, they would have clips to, they introduce it, and then you have a clip of somebody on the street talking nonsense to get their 15 seconds of fame, or something like that. But that's kind of the idea. Not too many people do that in podcasting because they don't really have that draw from other entertainment facilities. So you can do things like that help stretch out your podcast without you having to just snarf and sneeze and do things that I don't care about.
Exactly. And Elijah, you've done some incredible work behind the scenes for the art of branding. Let's get some more ears on that. How can people work with you?
Your podcast, sidekick.com, is my blog, podcast, website. I do a lot of podcast publications. I have some contact details. You can check out the reviews and the portfolio that I've done. And I'm on LinkedIn, Instagram, Threads, and somewhere else, I'm sure. But I'm sure you'll be able to have those. If you don't, I can forward you links through the description. No sweat. As always, happy to answer questions. And some people have come to me from audits, believe it or not, from the examples that I've shared. They're like, this is a neat little tease. Maybe I can give you some money to do that. So trying different things works. I try to take on things and topics that are a little bit more unique and serious, and stuff that's a little more deep diving, so that people that have started and they're a bit established, they'll get something out of it. And also those people that are starting and they're super green at podcasting will get something too. So if you don't want to necessarily start, or you don't want someone to kind of take over your podcast right away, there's tons of free podcast resources, your podcast, sidekick.com.
Badass. Well, thank you for listening to the Art of Branding podcast. Want to support? Drop a 5-star review so that we can keep this going and ready to shift your business from just another to the obvious one. Visit Badassery to get started. Let's freaking go. Woot woot.
Time for bloopers. Yay!
Well, like whenever we start,
Oh,
we
boy.
start. I mean, you can easily delete it out, right? Oh boy.
Yeah, maybe. We'll see. Oh boy.
Yeah, no. Like compared to everybody else that's on podcasts and videos and whatever, like they have like a whole freaking bookshelf. I swear, like most people just own a library in their house, which I'm kind of envious of.
Just decoration of fake books. It's very nice in the background.
Oh,
Not
come
yours, but
on.
other people. Like this. I think that's why people have so many books. It's just decoration. I'm pretty sure.
They're actually like, it's actually just a hidden wall. Like I look too much into it. I'm like, maybe if you press one of those books, it's gonna like open up into like a secret passageway. Oh
you
God!
pull it out a bit. Yeah. I like that. That's a good idea.
All the imagination.
that.
I can't even. All right, let's start. Badass.